Yeah, welcome to today's panel discussion on the current situation in and around Nagorno Karabakh. When we designed this event, the war in Nagorno Karabakh was still in full swing. So the war that was launched by Azerbaijan at the end of September, a war that was launched against the so-called Republic of Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh, but de facto, of course, also against Armenia. And this war, of course, has to be seen in the broader context of a conflict that has shattered, that has been going on in the region for decades, or one could even say for centuries. And during combat operations, many Armenian soldiers, I think more than 1,300 Armenian soldiers have been killed. We don't know anything about, we don't know any exact figures about the losses among Azeri soldiers, but of course, not only soldiers, but due to the bombing of residential areas, also civilians were killed, and more than 100,000 people fled during the war operations. And the war was not just restricted to the region of Nagorno Karabakh, but also to surrounding districts that had been occupied by Armenians after at the end of the last war, in the beginning of the 1990s, and had been occupied until this war. They were now recaptured by Azerbaijan. And after the capturing of the city of Shusha, a ceasefire was negotiated mainly by Russia. And let me show you briefly a map that shows you the territory of Nagorno Karabakh and the surrounding territories. So here you see on the left side Nagorno Karabakh, and in yellow the territories that were occupied, controlled by Armenia. And on the right side you see the new arrangement due to the ceasefire, with losses of the territory of Nagorno Karabakh, and in purple you see the territories that have been recaptured by Azerbaijan. Thank you, Alessia. Over the next 60 minutes, we will discuss the essence of the ceasefire, the repercussions for the so-called Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh and its inhabitants. We will discuss the potential return of refugees, of Azerbaijani refugees, and we will also discuss the future role of international actors in the region. And I'm very, very grateful to my three discussants tonight, and let me introduce them to you. I start with Azar Babayev. Azar Babayev is assistant professor at the ADA University, the former Azerbaijan Diplomatic Academy in Baku. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, that most of you will know as Hessische Stiftung für Friedens- und Konfliktforschung. I also welcome Richard Giragosyan, a political analyst. After a career in the US as analyst and consultant, Richard Giragosyan is the founding director of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan. And I also welcome Günther Bechler, political scientist, diplomat, and artist. Throughout his career, Bechler had various positions in academia and in diplomatic service, and from 2016 to 2018, and this is of interest to us here, he worked as a special envoy of the OSCE for the South Caucasus. And Günther Bechler resigned in 2018 from diplomatic service, but continues to provide advice to the Foreign Office of Switzerland, but also to the OSCE. And before I open the discussion, let me give you some technical information first. We will start with a panel discussion and then open the floor also for questions from the audience, from you. You can send us your questions already in between. For this, please use the function F&A that you see on the bottom of your screen, F&A, questions and answers. I kindly ask you to indicate your name, but if you don't want to, it is okay. We will also take questions who come anonymously. And my colleagues, Lesia Seminina and Henrik Koblischka, are in charge of all technical questions and will also forward your questions to me. And please note that this session will be recorded for future download on our website. So thank you. Thank you also to Lesia and to Henrik. Günter Bechler, let me start with you. I have already mentioned the ceasefire that was signed by the Prime Minister of Armenia and the presidents of Russia and Azerbaijan on the 9th of November. So what, from your point of view, are the most decisive elements of the ceasefire?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this important discussion. I would like to express my deep sorrows to all sides about the heavy losses of human lives, both armed forces, but also civilians in the battlefield and around. I think this is a big tragedy. And I feel really sorry for all this. And I could not have imagined during my term that this is going to happen. Also, that there were a lot of signs that a war is not to be excluded in the near future. Secondly, I think one has to reiterate that this war could have been avoided. It was an unnecessary war with a lot of battle death, with a lot of destruction and victims. Why do I say this? Because we do have all the documents and international treaties in place to avoid such kind of warfare around and about Karabakh. Both ceasefire agreements of 1994, where Karabakh, by the way, was a signatory, so recognized as an international partner for a treaty, repeated in 2016 after the last escalation in April, and this was still valid. So these documents, together with the Madrid principles, introduced in the ministerial conference in Madrid in 2007, provided a valid basis for a political and negotiated settlement. And I think all sides knew that, and there were a lot of efforts by the Minsk Group co-chairs, Russia, US, and France, by the OSCE chairmanships, by the international community, to avoid this war and to find a negotiated settlement without changing the situation through warfare. In that sense, the international law was violated in many ways, and all sides are in a way responsible for that. I mean, it was illegal in terms of the use of violence, of aggression, of violating treaties and international law based on ceasefire agreements. And it was a violation also of humanitarian international law in many ways, and we have to address this seriously because it is an illegal war with a lot of damage and with war crimes committed, I would say, most often by both sides. Against this, of course, this 9-point agreement is very important. It stopped the war immediately. And it is a very particular agreement because it didn't say anything about, the retreat of troops, etc., but it was a stop of warfare immediately, and the troops had to be there where they were at this moment of the signature in the midnight of the 9th to the 10th November. So this was, of course, a crucial issue to stop warfare as soon as possible. Of course, it came at a very late moment. I think for Armenia, the war was almost lost. And there were dramatic appeals also from Nagorno Karabakh that they cannot defend the territory, the country, the republic, however you call it now, anymore. So it came at the very last moment. This 9-point agreement stopped the violence, and it established a peacekeeping force by the Russian Federation to establish peacekeeping troops along the line of contact as well as the Lachin corridor. So this was certainly extremely important for all sides to stop warfare and the destruction. At the same time, also it opened the way for the return of refugees and IDPs, and also in the last provision, number 9, to open some of the corridors, Lachin, as I mentioned, but also the corridor between the westernmost regions of Azerbaijan and the enclave of Nakhichevan. And also it opens the way for further agreements about regional transport routes in the region of Nakhichevan and South Armenia. Of course, there are a lot of questions, and there is nothing about procedures, about mechanism, about how to handle the withdrawal of troops from all sides, about how to introduce mechanism of the return of IDPs and refugees, to which areas, how is the protection going to be organized, the question whether the Russian peacekeeping troops would need an international legitimation, where there would be a UN Resolution Security Council. All the questions that had been foreseen in the Madrid principles are still open. The question is also whether the Minsk format is going to continue, on what basis. Is it the same principles as in the Madrid document, or what happens now with the violence that has been used in order to implement part of it without negotiations? So there are many, many questions about the referendum, about the interim status. So for me, it is important, yes, the warfare stopped. It was anyhow illegal, but now we have maybe more questions than before, and we have a human tragedy at all sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this first assessment. And you already mentioned a lot of questions that I hope we will discuss, I hope we will tackle over the next hour. Babayev, it is obvious that the sheer military force of Azerbaijan led to the ceasefire. So if you have a look at the agreement, to put it bluntly, is it satisfactory for Azerbaijan, or do you see that Azerbaijan also made some concessions?
Gabriele, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to talk to your audience. Indeed, that's a very, very important, interesting question. For Azerbaijan, in the first instance, of course, it is a victory, a military victory. You know, the first Karabakh war, Azerbaijan lost, and now it seems so that Azerbaijani side this time won the war. that's maybe again objectively speaking most important outcome of this event, yeah, so to speak. But again, that's again generally I agree with Günther Bechler what he said, but one thing always very, very important about this conflict, yes, that's the origins of this conflict. Why we have this creation internationally, especially from international perspective. One thing very important, yeah. In general, we have this interpretation: it's an ethnic conflict. It is a status conflict. This is about Nagorno Karabakh. Yeah, and Nagorno Karabakh Armenians who strive to upgrade their status as such. But from today's perspective, that's very, very important. This conflict is also a problem of occupation and about surrounding territories, about these territories that are occupied by Armenian forces.
Yes, but sorry, but now the occupation has stopped. And if we have a look at the ceasefire, do you see in the agreement, is it satisfactory, do you think, for Azerbaijan?
Yeah, that's satisfactory for Azerbaijan's side because all these surrounding territories will be given back to Azerbaijan. Already in the course of this war, 4 of them already retaken. And 3 of them, the remaining 3 of them, will be given back as part of this ceasefire agreement. That's also very important. This is just a ceasefire agreement. This is not a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement. As part of this, the remaining three regions also will be given back to Azerbaijan. In this regard, of course, it is very, very satisfactory for them because, again, it is not just about the states of Nagorno Karabakh, but also about the surrounding regions. In this regard, yeah, of course, also in the military context, but also in the context of the ceasefire agreement, it is satisfactory for Azerbaijani side. Now, of course, that's also maybe later on we will talk more about this. The Azerbaijani refugees or internally displaced people, they are now, it seems so that they now can return to their homes. Yeah, in this regard, definitely. It is militarily, it is a victory for Azerbaijan. No question about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Richard, for the majority, of course, of people from Armenia, for Armenians, this is a complete defeat. But Günther Bechler already pointed out that the agreement is very, very vague in many ways. Where do you see space for negotiation?
Well, I think, first of all, good evening, but more than space for negotiation, the Russian-crafted, Russian-imposed agreement raises more questions than it provides answers. In other words, I'm greatly concerned over 2 distinct elements. First is, what are the long-term implications from the Russian military peacekeeping deployment? First, I'm worried that in general, there's no such thing as Russian peacekeepers. And once they deploy, they usually don't go home. I'm worried about the leverage this gives Moscow over both Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh, but also Russian leverage over Azerbaijan. Beyond the long-term implications of this Russian military presence, which is unprecedented, this was a rare conflict where Russia previously did not have a military presence on the ground. The second concern is the human security and safety of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh is now dependent on 2,000 lightly armed Russian peacekeepers. That is a worry going forward. But what's most important is, from an Armenian perspective, we had no choice. we had little alternative but to accept this Russian-imposed agreement in order to save lives, stop the fighting, and to salvage what was left of Nagorno Karabakh. The next challenge we are now facing is a return to diplomacy, hopefully sincere, serious diplomacy based on a new reality. The question of self-determination versus territorial integrity is still relevant. We do not yet know the outcome or the negotiated resolution of the issue of the status of the remainder of Nagorno Karabakh. At the same time, we need to bring back the OSCE Minsk group. This cannot be a Russian unilateral effort. If we're looking post-conflict, and if we're looking at the diplomatic challenge, the imperative and the necessity is for fellow co-chairs, France and the United States, to return to a diplomatic formula and process that already exists. And we need the interlocutors and all parties to the conflict to sit down and engage in serious negotiations to ensure and prevent a resumption of hostilities and to stabilize the region.
Thank you very much. Günther Bechler, in the beginning, you said that the agreement is very, very vague, that it leaves, in a way, more questions than that it gives answers. So where do you see the options for a future status of Nagorno Karabakh? Because as far as I see, the agreement does not say anything about the status of Nagorno Karabakh.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was mentioned by Richard already. I mean, there are many questions. It doesn't say anything about the status, which in a way is quite good because it is a preliminary declaration. It is not even an agreement in that sense, because the peace agreement still has to be negotiated and has to follow with a comprehensive kind of assessment of the situation. So it is, in the narrow sense, yes, an end of hostilities, an immediate stop. And I think the main thing was to bring the Russian Federation peacekeepers to the ground. And indeed, I mean, in all the discussions in the last few years, what we were saying as special envoys, as co-chairs and so on was, let's have a negotiated deal about the status of Karabakh, interim provisions, a referendum at the end as to determine the final status, but also to negotiate, and it's part of the Madrid Agreement, the 7 so-called occupied territories, provinces or rayons around Karabakh. And I think this was an issue, of course, also with Armenia, that this has to be negotiated as part of the settlement. And of course, nobody wanted to have just unilateral national so-called peacekeeping forces of any country, and certainly also not of Russia in the region again. And it was really the only place where there were no Russian forces on the ground. We have Moldova, we have Ukraine, we have the Crimea, we have Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, etc. Now they are all over the Southern Caucasus, with, of course, quite a weight. And by the way, the first day, the 7th, 8th of November, they talked about also Turkish peacekeeping forces. I think this did not happen and will not happen, but this would have been even more violation of the international law than what happened now. So we have no legitimation, neither by OSCE nor by the Security Council, for such kind of an activity. And I mean, we had daily consultations among the Minsk co-chairs, among the personal representative, etc. So why then, at the very end, you know, to kind of exclude the format that was there for many years in order to bring the facts to the ground? I think this we have to discuss. And frankly speaking, the Minsk group is weakened, the OSCE is weakened, we had a unilateral action, and I think it was on purpose to wait so many weeks till there is a situation the big neighbor could come in with unilateral forces and to impose them on all sides. So with this, I think before we really start discussing status, it's not the first thing now, but we need clarification about the interim mechanism now. What is Karabakh for Azerbaijan, for all sides at the moment? How is going to UNHCR, HCR and others, how do they manage to bring refugees, IDPs back? To which areas? Foreign Minister Lavrov was saying a few days ago, they can go back everywhere where they come from. So Azerbaijani IDPs, they can go to the whole of Karabakh, and Armenian IDPs, they can go back to Shushi and other places. Is this going to happen? Is this realistic without any kind of mechanism of reconciliation, of how to live in peace? There is nothing around, there's just a military solution at the moment with a third party engaged. So we need now, in a way, the 4 commissions that were foreseen in the Madrid principles, 4 working groups, commissions to deal with these issues among all stakeholders, among all parties involved, to find political and technical solutions to the most urgent problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, so we will not talk about the status of Nagorno Karabakh now, because it still is so unclear. But if we talk about the return of refugees, I mean, we have the Russian peacekeeping troops now. Do you see that they can guarantee that they can give any security that would really allow for the return of people from the so-called Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh to come back to the territory? Richard, how do you see this?
Well, I would actually define the issue a little differently. I see a 2-stage process in terms of the return of Azerbaijanis to the districts of Azerbaijan beyond the borders of Nagorno Karabakh, which is quite different. The return to Nagorno Karabakh proper, I think, will be subject to negotiation in one key sense. If we look at a lesson from the Middle East, the right of return is more important than the actual practical return. In other words, there must be an offer of the right of return. And in many ways, there is hope that such a possibility is both practical and necessary in terms of what has always been an Azerbaijani minority within Nagorno-Karabakh. But this depends also on the nature of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. And this remains to be worked out. In this context, I'm very pleased that I'm not a diplomat, because this is probably a very difficult challenge. Having said that, the right of return is essential for also regaining a degree of confidence or building confidence. What's the real problem is the starting point. Because in many ways, what worries me about the military victory by Azerbaijan is not the territorial gains. What worries me more is it looks like or suggests that conflicts can be resolved by force of arms rather than subject to international diplomacy. That's a dangerous precedent. The second worry is the war validates authoritarian governments in Azerbaijan and Turkey, and a beleaguered, embattled infant democracy in Armenia has lost. In this context, it's a setback for European values and ideals. And we need to be clear, hopefully, that the diplomatic outcome does not reward the aggressor and is not based on force of arms over diplomacy. And this is important in terms of the context of a small democracy being attacked by authoritarian states.
Yeah, and this, of course, is a vital point. We may come back to it if we manage also to talk about the role of the EU. But let me briefly come back to the question of the return or the right of return for refugees. Azerbaijan. I think there are more than 600,000 former refugees, Azerbaijani refugees. Do you think most of them will now return to the recaptured regions? And what do you think would be preconditions also for the return of refugees from Armenia?
Very interesting question, Gabriel. Okay, we have differentiate between the surrounding territories and Nagorno Karabakh proper. I don't see any problem in returning Azerbaijani refugees or internally displaced persons returning to surrounding territories.
Can you please speak up, Azer?
Yeah.
We can hardly hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, we have this differentiation, Nagorno Karabakh and surrounding territories. In this regard, I don't see any problem that Azerbaijani refugees or internally displaced persons, individuals, would return back to surrounding regions already, liberated. And this is a difficult problem. Yeah, it's indeed one of the important aspects of this ceasefire agreement, how it is regulated, how it is allowed that Azerbaijani people would return to Nagorno Karabakh itself. That's indeed very, very interesting question, because as we know, during the Soviet time, we had also again this Azerbaijani minority living within the Nagorno Karabakh, not only Armenians. And that's also, again, this open question is the context of this peace, or better to say, this agreement. That's again, this is very important. This difference. This is not a peace agreement. It is just a ceasefire agreement. We shouldn't read a lot into this agreement. It is just a ceasefire agreement.
Okay.
In this regard, I don't see any problem. But we have these logistical problems. For example, all houses, all infrastructure is destroyed, and we need some time that Azerbaijani refugees or internally displaced persons have to return to this. It will take some time. There's no question about it.
Okay, so Günther Bechler, we have already briefly talked about the role of the OSCE. I mean, if we have a look at the ceasefire, it is generally seen as a victory for Azerbaijan and a defeat for Armenia, but one could also say it's a victory for Russia and a defeat for the OSCE, and especially the Minsk group. I don't know if you would agree to this, but where do you see the future role of the Minsk group?
Yeah, it is certainly a defeat for international diplomacy, for multilateralism, for mediation, for political settlements of conflicts, and as such also for the OSCE, which is at the moment in a very bad shape. We know we have no Secretary General. OSCE is divided. We do have a lot of conflicts in the Permanent Council about all these issues. And by the way, Armenia and Azerbaijan both were more or less occupying the Permanent Council for the last few years with the topic of Karabakh and without any solution. So yes, it is a defeat of international and peace diplomacy. And this is very sad, of course. It's not the first time. We see it as a trend nowadays in many places, which of course should not continue. And we have to strengthen international institutions, organizations like OSCE, as well as international law. But if we do not somehow take those responsible for war crimes to the court, and nothing will really happen. That's another problem we cannot discuss maybe now, but this is also some kind of impunity now for war crimes is just worldwide going on. OSCE. Of course, now yesterday was a meeting of State Secretary Pompeo with Mr. President Macron, and Pompeo is also visiting the region. Georgia, and so on. And the idea was, at these talks yesterday, that Minsk, the co-chairs, should play a role, of course, in terms of protection, in terms of humanitarian support, in terms of really ending violence. In that sense, also, I think they would have to organize a donors conference to raise money, to bring people back, to establish some kind of funds for reconstruction and rehabilitation. So a lot of things have to be done because of this kind of warfare. I mean, the only gain in a way is these 7 territories, which might be important for Azerbaijan, but all the other questions are still open. All the questions of the Minsk group we have been discussing since '94, in a way, are still open. And now the most delicate question is, of course, the status of Nagorno Karabakh. How is it going to be defined? And when you see some statements, both from Armenian Prime Minister, but also from the President of Azerbaijan, you see that there is still a polarization on that question. So it's not really solved now through this kind of Russian-friendly intervention. And here I see a role of Minsk and of the OSCE and the international diplomacy. I would have wished, but this is very tricky in a way. You know, in the past few years, the Minsk format was the only one that was accepted for negotiations. Well, both sides always complained that this is not leading anywhere. But the EU several times wanted to play a more active role, be it the special representative, be it the Foreign Action Service, etc., and be it some co-chairs and chairmen in office of the OSCE that were also in the EU and EU country. It was not allowed to come in with some ideas to support, you know, the parties to conflict, with some ideas about diplomacy, about how to implement the Madrid. It was just not allowed, and EU was not strong in that sense. And I would have wished, but now that's wishful thinking, that in summer, and with the change of government in Armenia, that maybe Mr. Pashinyan and his supporters would have discussed with EU not only the support in terms of democratization, but also the peace agreement and the Madrid principles and how to implement them. But they didn't allow, in fact, you know, to come in and to discuss it because they wanted to hand it over to the Minsk format, complaining at the same time that this is not going to work. Of course, the main issue was that neither side was ready to really compromise. We know it from all the meetings and negotiations with the 2 presidents we had in Switzerland, etc. There was no way that they would give in and change their position. So they really wanted to have 100% right. And now we have a war and diplomacy was not functioning anymore. I think this is the lessons learned. You know? If there are treaties, if there are processes, I think there are ways to follow. And also Mr. Lavrov made it very clear in his recent speech. For 15 minutes, he was speaking about the way this could have been avoided. And at this point, he's absolutely right.
Thank you. I will come back to the role of the EU, but let me take in one of the questions that we've had so far from Jürgen Römer. Besides the politics, wouldn't it be urgently necessary to search influence on the hyper-nationalism on all sides, on the horrifying hatred between the region's peoples? Is there a chance for this? So I think this is a question that goes to you also, Richard Giragosyan, and to you, Azerbaijan. Richard.
Well, of course, I couldn't agree more. What we see is a dangerous, bellicose, aggressive rhetoric. Unfortunately, there is a reaction for every action. In other words, an Azerbaijani military officer beheading another Armenian officer in a NATO language course in Budapest and then being promoted and rewarded. This was very destructive. At the same time, it's a race to the bottom. we need to challenge the narrative and overcome what seems to be a cycle of revenge and retribution, ethnic-based. Fortunately, the onset of democracy in Armenia in 2018 gives us a tremendous advantage to be able to graduate beyond that. But I do think that the Aliyev family in Baku ruling Azerbaijan for 27 years, that kind of form of government is not necessarily as tolerant and certainly not democratic. This is a missing partner for peace. And I do think that that should not be an excuse or an obstacle, however. We need to challenge the narrative now. And this also includes the destructive role of Turkey in both the war and in the post-conflict diplomacy. But I think in many ways, from a civil society point of view, we need to be much more civil in civil society and actually need to leverage the synergy from democratic institutions in Armenia to change the script, if you will. Nationalism should no longer resonate as much as it has in this region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Since you have already mentioned Turkey, and since we have two questions from the audience, from Walter Kaufmann from the Heinrich Böll Foundation and Achim Klüppelberg from the Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, who ask both, how do you assess the role of Turkey? And maybe Azerbaijan, you could start. So, I mean, it is obvious that Turkey was striving for more influence in the South Caucasus. And does the current arrangement give Turkey really a more active role? And I think it will also be interesting to see how do you see the balance of power between Russia and Turkey in the future?
Gabriele, that's maybe the most important aspect of this escalation. Yes, it's changing your political or your strategic context of this conflict. Now we have also Turkey as an important external actor. But before Turkey, that's very important, we had Russia, the external actor. And Russia kind of a sporting power for Armenia. And Azerbaijan kind of again felt that, okay, it is alone in this conflict. And that's kind of, and then the stabilizing impact of this Armenia and Russia alliance. Now, what changed in the last months or the last years? Now we have Turkey as an important player in this game. And Turkey is saying to Azerbaijan again, okay, you have this conflict. And from Azerbaijan perspective, we can say, okay, it is an unjust situation. It is not okay that the Azerbaijani territory is not only Nagorno Karabakh, but all the surrounding territories occupied by Armenia for decades, and nobody cares about a solution of this conflict. Yeah, effectively. Now we have Turkey as a partner, as an important player in this context, saying, you Azerbaijan, and you can solve this problem, politically or militarily, and we will support you. Some kind of, again, this is balance that we have in this change situation. Armenians have Russia, and Azerbaijanis have Turkeys. This, again, that's in a way, from a realist perspective, it is again.
But what does it mean? Where do you see the future role? Where do you see the future role of Turkey in the region?
Okay, what we have, and Günther also talked about the Minsk group, and again, that's already some voices saying Minsk group is already dead, almost dead. Now what we have in this context, we have Russia, again, a very potent player in this context, and now we have a new player, we have Turkey, and what we have this interaction between Turkey and Russia, and many things in terms of solving this conflict, I think, will depend on this interaction between Russia and Turkey. That's very obvious. Again, then in a way, one would say it is maybe it is not a positive development in terms of liberal interaction, again, in terms of Western or European values. But again, what we have in our region currently, it is great power politics.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, that's again also very important, this point, they are this great power politics as very efficient. Again, look at the ceasefire agreement. Again, it is because of Russia that this war stopped, this war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Yeah, we have to take note of real developments again, and that's realistic. Again, in a way, again, we have usually, again, in international relations, that's very interesting. We have this liberal approach to conflict resolution, and we have also a realist approach to conflict resolution. In this regard, this conflict is a good example, I would say, for a realist solution of a complicated problem.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add a little bit about
Richard,
Turkey.
yes.
There are two observations, and I agree with our colleague from Azerbaijan. Turkey has, in the war especially, adopted an unprecedented destructive role in direct military support and engagement in favor of Azerbaijan, emboldening and empowering Azerbaijan, while Russia was uncharacteristically passive for many weeks. But the second observation is this new Turkish reassertion of power and influence is not new, nor is it limited to this region. This is a broader effort by the Turkish President Erdogan in Libya, Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean. This is very predictable behavior, and it's much less the NATO ally it once was in terms of the West. Therefore, it's the relationship between Presidents Erdogan and Putin that in many ways will define Turkey's role going forward. But at the same time, interesting observation, given the result of the war, Turkey now has no justification and no political cover to keep its border with Armenia closed. We may see pressure to reopen that border as well, which is an interesting development, very unexpected, also because the closed border is between Turkey and not just Armenia, but between Turkey and the Eurasian Economic Union, which Armenia is a member of, therefore giving dividends to Moscow. So this is a much more long process with deeper implications when we look at Turkey's role.
Mm-hmm, thank you. Günther Bechler, could you briefly give an assessment of where do you see Turkey's future role in the South Caucasus?
I think certainly not in military terms. I think with this kind of entry into the war on one side, an illegal war, as I said, also Turkey conducted illegal warfare according to international law. With all the negotiations in Turkey and Russia in the last few days, I think Russia made it very clear that Russia is in power, is in charge of peacekeeping. They allow Turkey to come in for the peacekeeping center as a monitoring unit in Azerbaijan with no troops, with no mobility, and with no kind of military equipment. I see more a role of a supporter, and as Richard just pointed out, according to Article 9 of the ceasefire agreement, there is an opening there, you know, when there are agreements, and I think there is a pressure, a growing pressure, to agree on certain regional kind of mechanism to open up transport routes for camions, for railways, etc., etc. So it might be a side effect. And then, of course, I think Turkey will certainly use these new options through Nakhchivan to link it up with Azerbaijan and Central Asia instead of using the Caucasus route through Georgia. So there might be a new element of this of Turkish trade routes maybe linked with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So there is a new way here close to the Iranian border. It may also help the Armenian side to open the railway and maybe also trade routes with Turkey, with Iran, so it could be a regional player also. This might be some side effects, but I think now Turkey was really pokering high, but with this agreement now, they are not part of it, and I think the agreement in a way stopped the Turkish ambitions to be there also as a power player somehow.
Mm-hmm. Azerbaijan, a brief question. Yeah. I mean, you now have these Russian peacekeeping troops on the territory of Azerbaijan. Do you see that Azerbaijan's position vis-a-vis Russia is weakened through the current situation?
Very interesting question, Gabrielle. Indeed. Okay, generally, I already mentioned this is a big victory for Azerbaijani side, military victory, but this is a kind of this bitter aftertaste of this victory. Now we have Russian boots on Azerbaijani territories. That's very, very important. Again, I also again observe the Azerbaijani internal discussions. That's the most important, again, this point in this context. And now we have Russian troops on Azerbaijani soil. That's generally, again, it's a very, very important point. Again, of course, I think it's also not good for Armenian side. Now we have Russians in Nagorno Karabakh. Now, Nagorno Karabakh not only, again, that's this point, controlled by Armenians. Now it is controlled primarily is controlled by Russians. That's very, very important in terms of geopolitical developments in this context. Now we have Russians. And what does it mean? Again, these implications are very, very important. Now we have, again, this change situation. Now Azerbaijani sides as victor, Armenian sides as loser in this war. Again, this changed roles in this conflict. But what's new? We have Russians on the ground, Russian boots on the ground. That, I would say, just strategically most important development. And I think that's not also, again, it's not just, again, primarily maybe it is not good for Azerbaijani side, but it's also good for Armenian side that we have now Russians as third party directly involved in this conflict.
Thank you.
That's very, very important, I think, geostrategically, this aspect of the last developments.
Okay, thank you. Richard, there is another question to you concerning speculation that Moscow was happy to use the opportunity to weaken Pashinyan and democratic reform in Armenia. So, is the short democratic spring in Armenia under existential threat?
Well, the short answer is yes, definitely. The somewhat longer answer is it's really no surprise. In 2018, there was a rare victory of nonviolent people power, ushering in a new democracy in the Republic of Armenia. What's interesting is it was empowered by a genuinely free and fair election with the rare commodity of legitimacy in this region. Russia, of course, has long seen this Armenian democracy and the Pashinyan government as an inherent threat to Putin's model of preferred authoritarian states in the near abroad. And I do think that Moscow, in addition to a degree of complicity with Turkey at the launch of Azerbaijan's attack, has also allowed Putin to exert leverage and pressure over the Armenian government. And in many ways, this day forward, democracy and reform in Armenia is under threat, under assault, and imperiled. It is up to us to defend the institutional democracy of Armenia, not individual Democrats per se, but institutional democracy.
Thank you very much. We are already coming to the end of our discussion, and I would like to come back to the role of the EU. I mean, apparently there is a lot of disappointment in Armenia. This is what the narrative says, that Armenia now as somehow a young democracy after the revolution of 2018 was in a way looking forward to the EU for support and now feels failed by the EU. Do you agree to this narrative? Do you think there is something in it?
Well, yes. First of all, not only were we alone in solitude, but there was silence, the deafening silence of the international community, partly because of the COVID-19 situation and crisis, and more importantly, because of distraction with the US elections, the crazy, unpredictable nature of the Trump administration, and division within the European Union. To be realistic, however, perhaps we had too high expectations that our democratic credentials, our embrace and affirmation of European ideals would be enough to welcome interest and engagement. It clearly wasn't, but it is a stark lesson learned. However, this doesn't mean we turn away from democracy or the European model. Certainly, Russian values of corruption and authoritarianism have more in common with Azerbaijan, to be honest, than with Armenia. So I am optimistic that this is not the end of our orientation.
Thank you for this. Günter Bechler. So what is your assessment of the role of the EU, and is there any future role of the EU in the region?
So do you ask a diplomat or do you ask a Swiss?
I ask you.
Look, I'm quite pragmatic in a way. If I would be negative, I would say Europeans lost the Southern Caucasus in 1919, and it is about to lose the Southern Caucasus again. We do have a democratic experiment in Armenia under pressure. We do have a struggle in Georgia after elections that is also going into a direction that is not really wished by the European Union or by the European partners. Azerbaijan is already an authoritarian government. Russian forces are all over the place now, not only in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, but Armenia, and even in Azerbaijan. By the way, both foreign ministers agreed always in the past during discussions that one thing they don't want, Azerbaijan and Armenia, is Russian peacekeeping forces on the ground. And that's what they got now a few days ago. So I see a next phase where it is very difficult for the European Union to be really active and to influence the situation politically, strategically on the ground. Maybe they can help with some programs in economic, social, humanitarian terms. That's always welcomed also by Moscow in a way to wage a war and then ask Europeans to pay the bill, as we have seen in other places too. So I don't see really a strategic role at the moment. Brussels first has to prove that they can play this role. I don't think they are able at the moment. And the way Russia played this card, very strategically, and of course, with a lot of experience, of course, in an area you may say this is under Russian influence anyhow, is fantastic. So neither US nor Brussels were able to do anything. There was silence, and now slowly they start to wake up and see what happened. And I think it is very serious for the Southern Caucasus, for democratic experiment, for also economic integration, for all kind of what we had at the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements in the region. I think it's all under pressure, and I think we need serious discussion in all international formats, also with our colleagues in Moscow about it. But I don't see, frankly speaking, the strong personalities in Brussels to do that at the moment.
So thank you also for your openness. My last question goes to, or the last question from the audience goes to Azerbaijan and Richard Giragosyan. So it's from Maximilian Fixler from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Thank you for this very important discussion regarding civil society in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Are there concepts or engagements on living together peacefully, for example, by NGOs? Azerbaijan, is there any role for NGOs in Azerbaijan?
One point I think is very, very, very important. I think we need to emphasize again as part of the big picture.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah. As part of the big picture, that's very, very important. Again, as this talk, again, this democracy problem, democracy issue, or a democracy versus authoritarian regime. One thing very important, I think, in the context of Nagorno Karabakh conflict. It is in the first instance about territorial integrity. It's about international law. It is not, again, one thing very important. Imagine we have more democratic government in Azerbaijan today. This would or had continued, no question about it. That's very, very important. Yeah, it is not that the democracy is more peaceful and less democratic governments is as a more war-oriented. That's again an illusion. A more democratic government, Azerbaijan, would be more assertive foreign policy. It is indeed a very, very interesting. You guys, indeed, please look at this condition. Azerbaijani army was very close to a definitive, a total victory, but they stopped. And ask yourself why. After the fall of Shusha, again, this militarily, it didn't make any sense why Azerbaijani side stopped. Again, look against the public opinion in Azerbaijan. It's kind of a stolen victory. Why we stopped instead fighting further and instead acquiring a final, a total victory in this conflict. That's again, I don't see this as Azerbaijani, but rather as a student of conflict resolution, a student of political science. Democracy and non-democracy, it is indeed a wrong discussion we are having in this regard. It is rather about again, that's also about Armenian government. We have this change in new leadership under Pashinyan.
Okay.
Again, yeah.
Since we are...
Yeah. It is also, again, this point very important. Again, it was, in terms of domestic politics, Pashinyan was under immense pressure domestically to be a good Armenian, who protect Armenian interests in Nagorno Karabakh.
Okay.
Democrat.
Sorry.
That's a problem in this regard, of course, I would say.
Okay.
It is not just that we have this authoritarian government or less authoritarian government in conflict.
Sorry to interrupt because we're coming to an end, but from what you say, I see that you don't really see a role for any kind of a civil society movement in Azerbaijan to ease the conflict. Richard, from your point of view.
I do see the role. It's ever more important than before for people-to-people contacts, track-to diplomacy between the Armenians in Karabakh and the Azerbaijani side. This is the essence of why democracy is important. We need to leverage that and invest in people-to-people contact and actually make the peace process much more inclusive, all parties to the conflict, including the Armenians from Nagorno Karabakh. They have to be able to negotiate their own future with the Azerbaijanis as well. But the key to a lasting, durable post-conflict stability is normalization based on people-to-people contact and civil society engagement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you all three for your contributions to this discussion. I mean, I think our discussion has shown very clearly that we have the ceasefire right now, but that this is just the beginning for sorting out how the future of Nagorno Karabakh and its inhabitants will be. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks a lot to the audience for joining us, for listening to us. I do apologize that we were not able to give answers to all the questions you were raising, but I hope it was interesting for you as well. So have a good evening and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.